everyone, welcome back to The Independent Pianist. This is Cole Anderson as usual, and today we're talking about Beethoven editions. This is quite the hot topic with the developing classical pianist, given how integral Beethoven is usually seen as being for the fostering of a complete artistic and mechanical piano technique. I have kind of a checkered history with Beethoven. You know, when I was a teenager or in my 20s, I usually avoided playing Beethoven sonatas in performances. I studied them very carefully. I went through all the sonatas at one time or another, not bringing them to performance level, but I certainly studied them and looked through them. But I always avoided actually bringing these works in for concerts. They're so well known, you know, there's such a daunting tradition built up around the performance of these works. So many complete recordings of the 32 sonatas out there to compare oneself to. I just never wanted to put myself up for that kind of comparison. I didn't feel ready for it in some way. So instead, I would always seek out more unusual repertoire in which I could feel a more unique connection to what I was doing and like I was doing something new. But now with advancing years, you know, I'm in my 30s and everything, and I find myself gravitating more and more back to these standard works. And I feel like I really have something unique and concrete of my own to contribute to this often tried repertoire. And I finally want to actually play them in concerts and of course put them on this channel. So since I have been looking into these pieces more and more, it's made me think about all the various editions of Beethoven sonatas that are out there. And I get asked frequently enough by students what edition I recommend for practicing Beethoven. And I have to say that I really think modern pedagogy has it completely backwards when it comes to choosing what edition to use to study Beethoven sonatas. Ever since the mid-20th century, it's been considered of the highest necessity to only use what is generally called an Urtext edition. Original text edition is what it literally means, particularly if you are studying the Viennese classics like Beethoven, Mozart, or Haydn. So what is an Urtext edition? For those of you who don't know, well, it's an edition that purports to be a text that most clearly represents the composer's original ideas. The editors of an Urtext edition go back to the original sources, if those are manuscript sources or first editions, and they try to determine what is the text that the composer really intended. They try also to correct mistakes, to spot mistakes, and mark them as well, usually in an editorial commentary. Generally, there are no other editorial emendations, though, besides fingerings in some Urtexts, although even that is becoming more and more rare with recent Urtext publications, because fingerings are considered to be an additional thing which the editor is adding in, which is not in the original. On a practical note, I think it is important to address the impossibility of truly presenting an original text in any form other than a facsimile of a manuscript or first edition. So if you are publishing a reprinting of a Beethoven sonata, there's going to be some editorial emendation and decision-making, like I was just saying. So the whole idea of it being possible to come to some definitive conclusion about what the original text is totally a lie, really. It's kind of a marketing thing built around this kind of craze that existed in the musical establishment in the mid-20th century for exact textual fidelity. So again, as I was saying, the closest you can really get to an original text is to go and look at the actual manuscripts or first editions. There are sometimes facsimile sources that allow you to do this, and then you would have to make the editorial decisions yourself to decide where sources don't line up, what is the decision to make, if there's a missing source or something that's only present in a much later edition, and so forth and so on. And obviously that's not practical in most cases. You want to have that spade work done for you. It's only reasonable. So from a practical point of view, it's a very good idea to have a nice, good, hefty Henle edition, you know, in your bookshelf of Beethoven sonatas. Henle is the most popular one. There are many others, of course. The Schenker Urtext, which is on IMSLP, is another pretty good one. It's a little older, but for the most part, he makes very good choices, and it's free. The Henle edition, of course, Bärenreiter, the Wiener Urtext, they're all good ones, which are much pricier, of course, but worth investing in. So, usually 9 times out of 10, if you hear a teacher recommend an edition to a student who is learning a Beethoven sonata, you will only hear them recommend an Urtext and nothing else. And to my view, this is total nonsense. Sure, an Urtext is very helpful for getting the best idea that you can of what a composer wrote and what the sources show. But when it comes to finding material that will actually help you as a player to understand and master these very enigmatic, difficult works, to really go beneath the surface and get to the heart of these pieces, Urtext editions really don't cut it in any way, shape, or form. All they'll generally have to help you is maybe fingerings and discussions of the sources and maybe a little background material, but frequently the fingerings that you see in Urtext editions are not exactly brilliant. They don't always find the most accomplished performers to put fingerings in these editions, honestly. There are exceptions, of course. I mean, there's a recent new edition that Henle is doing with Marie Pariah of the Beethoven sonatas. I'm sure that'll have amazing fingerings. Claudio Arrau did an amazing edition for Peters, which has all of his fingerings, which are very interesting and idiosyncratic. But in general, most of these Urtexts either don't have fingerings or they have fingerings which are hardly brilliant. So it's really a shame that we've kind of defaulted to only using Urtext, because there are amazing resources available to us out there of great performers and teachers who edited the Beethoven sonatas. More than any other body of work, the Beethoven sonatas have had some really great attention paid to them by artists. So there are two editions that I most highly recommend for students to use as references when they're learning Beethoven sonatas. One of those, of course, is the famous Arthur Schnabel edition. And the Schnabel edition is quite well known, I think. It's been reprinted by several publishers to the present day. So I want to talk about another one which is much less often used, although it was very common at one time at the end of the 19th century and at the beginning of the 20th century, and that is the Hans von Bülow edition, which was printed by Schirmer. So I have a beautiful old copy of this that I absolutely treasure, of this, which was, I think, printed around the turn of the century, which I picked up at a library sale. And if you can find, buy, steal this edition somehow, it's really, really worth it. So who was Hans von Bülow, first of all? Lovely looking fellow, isn't he? He was actually one of Liszt's greatest students. He was an early student of Liszt in the 1850s, and he was absolutely one of the most famous students. The only one who was comparable to him in stature was the ill-fated Karl Tausig, who died very young. Bülow, though, was a figure for most of the century as a teacher, pianist, and conductor. He was a famous champion of modern music, so he championed Liszt's music as a pianist and Wagner's music famously as a conductor. He conducted the premieres of Tristan und Isolde and Die Meistersinger von Nürnberg. So he was a real musical heavyweight. He was not at all the kind of flashy, superficial piano virtuoso that you might think of as a student of Liszt. No, he was a very powerful intellect, and he used that intellect to play only what he considered to be the greatest works by the classical masters as well as contemporary figures. In addition to that, he was also the very first musician to actually play the complete cycle of the 32 piano sonatas from memory in public. And of course, that's become more of a commonplace thing nowadays. People do it all the time. But at the time, that was, in the mid-19th century, that was an incredible thing that was unheard of. Nobody did things like that. So obviously, he obtained a great deal of inspiration from Liszt, who was kind of considered to be a foremost interpreter of Beethoven at that time, at least by some people. But he also formed his own very striking ideas about everything to do with these works from his long study and familiarity with these pieces. And this edition is brimful of all kinds of interesting, insightful perspectives, solutions to tricky musical problems, as well as his own highly idiosyncratic fingering. It's oftentimes brilliantly unorthodox, as one would expect from such an eminent performer. One little bit of warning though, Bülow did not edit all of the sonatas. He did this edition in tandem with another pedagogue, Sigmund Lebert. And so Lebert did 16 of the earlier sonatas, and Bülow did these other ones. Luckily, he did all the later ones, which are the most difficult ones to interpret anyway. So all the sonatas that Bülow edited are absolutely fantastic. I can't really recommend the Lebert edition as much. It's far less interesting. So as I was preparing this video and looking over this edition again, I came up with a list of like 24 or so interesting quotations from this edition. But I'm going to have to contain myself, of course, to only a few for this video. Otherwise, it's going to be 2 hours long. So Bülow was known for being uncompromising on musical matters, and he demonstrates that in many places, but here's a good example, is a footnote for the first movement of the Pathetique sonata. Execution like this, according to the rule of playing grace notes on the beat. beware of the facile and tasteless triplet in eighth notes, to which even the anticipated passing shake would be preferable, though against the rules. So he's recommending a performance like this, or like this, in preference to the much easier interpretation, like this. So this is actually pretty striking. Bülow was quite aware of the classical rules. He's referring to the rules that were laid down by C.P. Bach in his famous treatise on the true art of playing keyboard instruments, which Beethoven knew very, very well. And we don't usually give 19th century musicians credit for being aware of these things, but actually Bülow knew his stuff really well. Bülow was known for his acerbic, biting wit as well, and that's nowhere less in evidence than in this little footnote for Beethoven's Opus 109 Sonata. So usually in line with the literal distribution of rhythmic values, you will hear this passage played like this. Bülow, on the other hand, says, the alteration in the rhythmic division, which the editor has taken the liberty to make, is, with reference to the music itself, merely an apparent one. From his experience as a teacher, he considers this new external presentation adapted to check perversive conceptions on the player's part. Bülow was favoring a performance more like this. This is pretty funny, but it's also just sensible, as Beethoven would oftentimes go to rather great lengths to avoid using uneven note groupings, like fives or sevens, for example. It just wasn't common in music printing at that time. And undoubtedly, when he did this, it was simply a stand-in for a more seamless method of performance. So this highly literal reading of the 20th century, which is common for most famous interpreters of Beethoven, I haven't actually checked all the recordings, but I assume you would hear Brendel and Rau and all these other people do that in their recordings. For Bülow, he would have considered that to be kind of bizarre and being overly literal. So similar situations occur in the Cello Sonata in A major, as well as in the Violin Concerto. So like in a passage like this from the Cello Sonata, you usually hear it played kind of like this. So in that rendition, the triplets really stand out from the texture, but undoubtedly he meant for it to be played more like this, with the triplets and the 16th notes kind of combined into groups of 7. So it's not all technical things like this, though. There's another striking example of Bülow's imagination in this passage from the Waldstein Sonata, in which he suggests imagining the sound of different woodwind instruments in order to inspire a variety of color. So this is a fabulous idea, and it's great that he brings this up. I think it's absolutely amazing. We should always be considering the color of orchestral instruments and the voice when we are trying to make these pieces sound expressive. Not to say that we can literally make the piano sound like these different instruments, but it just gives you an inspiration to find different colors and different kinds of sound. So, as has already been established, Bülow was an irascible man, and he could be quite cutting and acerbic in person. He terrified the less talented members of Liszt's Weimar class in later years when he would visit when Liszt was indisposed. He would visit and lead the class, and he would systematically dismantle and forcibly eject anyone he thought was not worthy of Liszt's instruction. Liszt was much more forgiving of a certain amount of hangers-on who were not really that talented as pianists, just kind of being in his class. So a certain amount of that irascibility comes through in some of his notes. For instance, there's this one in the Moonlight Sonata. A very common amateurish error which we regret to say is countenanced here and in other places by Herr Lebert's otherwise so meritorious edition, is the notion that a closer legato is obtainable in descending octave passages by a change of fingers. Precisely the opposite effect is produced by the following manipulation. The higher part, the one most strongly affecting the ear, suffers a most sensible interruption. A slight muscular stretching of the palm of the hand, which is no harder to learn than shifting on a stringed instrument, will amply fulfill all requirements. So he's objecting to a performance like this. In which you change fingers on the lower note in order to provide a legato, and he's more in favor of something like this. In which you stretch the hand a little bit and kind of glide from octave to octave. And I think that if you are in fact trying to bring out the top voice, Bülow's solution is much better. On the other hand, if you actually wanted to bring out the bottom voice, then the other solution might actually be good. I don't think that it's necessarily amateurish. And of course, Lebert is the very one he's referring to as his co-editor of this edition, so Bülow couldn't even help himself but rag on Lebert's editorial choices here. So he was uncontainable in that regard. As for that though, I quite agree with Bülow about legato octaves. I think pianists often place way too much focus on coming up with elaborate ways to connect octaves, using the third, fourth, and fifth fingers to try to have these legato fingerings, and that could oftentimes do more harm than good because of the tension that it causes in your hand. So here's another one of Bülow's notes on the Waldstein Sonata. A smooth legato and octave playing is best attained not by an elaborate change of fingers at points of rest, but by the appropriate quiet carriage of the whole hand. Assiduous practice is of course an essential condition for the attainment of the requisite skill. So I think oftentimes the illusion of legato is actually harmed by using really elaborate fingerings, which cause you to get tense, which cause there to be unwanted accents and things like that. Sometimes just using the fifth finger is enough if you're pedaling as well and you create the illusion of legato effectively, using a very relaxed hand and a smooth carriage of it from point to point. So Bülow also weighed in pretty definitive terms on some sticky textual issues as well. For example, there's a debate about this famous passage in the Hammerklavier Sonata, first movement. And the debate centers around whether these notes should be A sharp, like this, or if they should be played as A naturals, like this. So with the A naturals, it's much more of a typical kind of progression for Beethoven's day. But here's what von Bülow has to say about it. The Beethoven improvers of former times, when the master's last works were outlawed, so to speak, changed the A sharp in the next two measures into A, and thus degraded the inharmonic originality to chromatic triviality. And then he goes on to speak about this and actually invokes Berlioz as well at one point in the note. It's quite interesting. I really love that whole thing about chromatic triviality and inharmonic originality. I mean, it's quite true. The version with the A sharp actually results in a much more interesting and original musical passage. But nowadays, Bülow has basically been proven wrong. I mean, there are sources which have come to light, sketches of this passage, in which Beethoven wrote A natural, several different sketches. The whole difficulty, of course, is that there was no manuscript for this piece. It was lost. There's only a first edition which has many mistakes. But in this passage, Liszt and Bülow preferred the A sharp, and you really could make an argument that it's preferable. Even though it's a mistake, it actually results in a better musical solution for that passage. So having said that, there are mistakes in this edition. There are errors in consulting the sources. Bülow didn't always have the same sources at his disposal, which we have now. There's another mistake at the end of the Moonlight Sonata. So Bülow very carefully marks that this should be a subito forte here, like this. But this is one place where actually in the original sources, Beethoven specifically wrote crescendo to forte. So I don't really think you should do that. It is kind of an interesting variant, but if you really want to follow Beethoven's markings, then you would want to do a crescendo there. So you definitely want to play from some kind of an Urtext edition. The Schenker edition that I mentioned would be good enough, really. That'll help you to guard against errors like the ones I mentioned previously. But I think that if you don't have this edition and the Schnabel edition open for reference whenever you're playing a Beethoven sonata, you're missing out on a veritable treasure trove of helpful information. These editions are priceless. It's like having the opportunity to reach through time and get basically a personal lesson from one of the greatest Beethoven interpreters of all time. It's extraordinarily powerful, this connection that you get, because these editions were so painstakingly edited. And it's extraordinary to me that this is so routinely neglected. You'll hardly ever see a student at a reputable conservatory using these editions at all. I certainly didn't know a single colleague of mine in undergrad who used either of these editions or even knew of them. They were just either they didn't know about them or they had been warned against them. And it was only later on in graduate school that I actually met a very great pianist and forte pianist who was in my same year who actually knew this edition and praised it. He was in a definite minority there. I think it was just because he played forte piano. He was playing instruments from Beethoven's time. So some things to keep in mind though, if you use this edition and also the Schnabel edition, their fingerings can be great, brilliant, but they are definitely unusual. So I would assume that for any experienced pianist, you're not likely to find more than, say, 25% of them that will work for you, if that. So don't expect to just use them all and be happy with them. Bülow had his own very unusual ideas about fingering, so you might end up disagreeing with most of them. But you're going to find some, I guarantee it, that are brilliant and that you're going to use and that will really help you. It's definitely worth it. Just take it all with a grain of salt and don't slavishly follow every indication that he gives. There's many things that I disagree with in Bülow's edition. For example, some of his awkward fingerings for repeated notes I really don't think are necessary, personally. And his injunction to omit the repeat in the last movement of the Appassionata Sonata I think is totally off base, but he has a very persuasive argument for why you should do that. I just happen to think that that's wrong myself. But there's so many brilliant ideas in this edition, you should definitely take a look. So what I usually do, I have the Urtext edition on the actual music desk when I'm practicing, and I have Bülow and Schnabel kind of open to either side so that I can look at them if there's a particularly tricky passage that I'm wondering about a good fingering, or if there's other points of interpretation that I'm not sure about. They usually always have something interesting to say. I hope you enjoyed that little discussion of Beethoven Sonata editions. Please do comment below if you have ideas or if you have an edition of the Beethoven Sonatas that you particularly like. Tell me why you like it and leave a comment about that. I'd be very happy to discuss these things further. If you can, please also consider supporting the channel. You can do that easily through www.patreon.com/independentpianist. To make monthly donations. That's a wonderful platform. Or you can also donate through some other links that I have in the description box. So please stay tuned. Next week we'll have some more performances. I'm thinking of getting into one of Beethoven's more famous sonatas next week. So we'll have a little series on that. And I'll also be uploading my video of the complete Schubert Opus 90 impromptus sometime in the next week before Friday. So you can also keep an eye out for that as well. But in the meantime, happy practicing. This is Cole Anderson signing off.